Welcome to the Artfully Learning audio series. I'm your host, Adam Zucker. Renowned modern artist Paul Klee famously described his explorations in drawing as an active line on a walk, moving freely without goal, a walk for walk's sake. In this episode, I'm speaking with artist and educator Ellen Mueller about how the oldest and most conventional form of transportation has become an art form. Walking artistically can help us live a more fulfilling and purposeful life. When we apply artistic theories and methods to our walks, we can turn ordinary walks into profound experiences that lead to good mental, physical, and creative well-being. Several years ago, my wife brought home a small book by Thich Nhat Hanh called How to Walk. Nhat Hanh's lessons on walking highlight the effect that being in the moment has on feeling joyful, enlightened, and inspired. He tells us to concentrate on breathing and not being concerned with the destination. Aside from the breathing exercises, the only thing to be aware of is the process of taking each step forward. This will subsequently lead the walker to have a greater sense of spatial awareness and a realization of how the environment and body works in tandem. Nhat Hanh states that when your foot touches the earth with awareness, you make yourself alive and the earth real, and you forget for 1 minute the searching, rushing, and longing that rob our daily lives of awareness and cause us to sleepwalk through life. The same principles of awareness are evident in the more than 300 examples of artworks and nearly 100 exercises Ellen Mueller presents in her book, Walking as Artistic Practice. The book is a great comprehensive guide to the history and progression of walking as an artistic process, showing how walking artistically can lead to more mindful understandings of ourselves, others, and the spaces we occupy. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Ellen to the program. Hey, Ellen.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
And thanks for joining me here. I'm really excited to talk about your practice and your work and your book, because I wrote about your work and a few other artists who incorporate walking in their practice on Artfully Learning, the blog version, last January. But you've literally written the book on walking as an artistic practice. So, when I wrote it, we hadn't spoken at all. I just came across your work in my research, and I was excited to come across so many artists who are doing so many things with walking and movement. But I'd like to hear firsthand about your own experiences and research that led to such a comprehensive guide. And we could maybe talk about the book, but also your journey into walking as an artistic practice.
Yeah, absolutely. I usually, when folks ask about how did the book come about and how does walking have a presence in my own practice, I start out going way back to my first encounter with walking as artistic practice was during my graduate experience at University of South Florida. I had amazing professors there, and one of them was Rosalinda Borchila, and she taught a class that was supposed to be about performance art and site-specific art. And when we got in there, it was kind of a fun bait and switch. She's like, "We're going to talk only about walking," and at the time I was like, "What?" But she totally won me over. Like it was such a great seminar, and she really was focused on accessibility in urban spaces. So a lot of our work at that time for that semester had that focus, and I started producing a little bit of work of my own that was walking as artistic practice. And then, to be honest, it kind of went on a back burner for a while. And I moved all over the country for various teaching jobs and things like that. And when I got to Minneapolis, they had a really cool program for continuing education where if you could propose a class and you could guarantee that you would get 5 people to sign up, you could teach anything. Like they would let you do any topic that you wanted. And I had walking sort of percolating in the back of my head for many years. And so I put that together as a 3-week workshop, and it really took off from there. So there was tons of interest, really delightful, amazing, engaged students who just really helped the topic bloom. And the first time I taught it was in 2019. It was in person. It was 3 weeks. We met once a week. And we looked into many of the topics that that show up in the book. And then it was so popular, I did it again summer of 2020. But as we all know, the pandemic happened. And so we transitioned to an online format, which at first we were like, oh no, we're going to miss that live walking in-person feeling. But it was actually very cool in that we had participants from all over the world, which was very cool. And we got to hear about wildly different experiences when we would come back together in the online space. We would do some online work, we'd break, everybody would go walk and do their exercises and then come back and talk about what they experienced and show their work. And it was just so cool. And that, again, because it was so popular, did it one more summer. So 3 summers in total, covered 3 topics every summer. And by the time I was done with that, I had essentially the content for 9 chapters in a book. And so I finished it up, added on a 10th chapter, and that's how we got to now.
I'm glad you mentioned the curriculum, because I was going to ask how this could be incorporated in a pedagogical context. And so you've answered that question, that it actually came from the field of education, your own classes that you took as a student. And now as an educator, you're expanding it with your students collaboratively. And it's such a great form because walking is such a fundamental means of transportation, and art, fundamental means of expression. So it makes sense that the two meet somewhere.
Yeah. And I've got, I'll always be a teacher at heart. Right now, I'm an arts administrator. But in the back of the book, I included a bunch of different sample syllabi and things to try to make it as easy as possible because it's such a fun topic. And I think it fits really well with people who are curious,
It is. And it's a great way to, you're in Minneapolis, I'm in New York. I think most people listening are in a place that is accessible, places that they could walk to safely. Hopefully, that's something that I've been noticing as I've traveled to a lot of different, not only cities, but smaller towns, that making pathways and trails within the urban or suburban environment is something that's been a thing amongst developers, this sort of zeitgeist now that's happening. So I'm glad to see that, because as you said, the curiosity that drives this practice comes from when you're walking. At least for me, it's a time for me to think and see. I'm using really all my senses, especially the more mobile senses, more tactile senses, but definitely a lot of thinking going on and conceptualizing, because you're looking and seeing and making sense of everything. So perhaps how would you define the walking as an artist versus, is it like walking for art's sake, or is it walking for walking's sake with art involved? Is it like a hybrid kind of concept? It's a very functional practice, but also there's a lot of artists who you mention in the book and your research too, who are more on the conceptual side, or maybe more abstract type of walking. And then there's some who are very functional about it and literal about it. So is there a sort of an umbrella term that could define this movement, or maybe some examples that you particularly like?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said there's so many different ways in to walking as artistic practice. And as I've studied the field, at first I probably would have said, well, I think it's a continuum, but I actually think it's even more complex than a line of from conceptual to more practical. I think it's more like a rhizome or a net, in that it can be so varied in so many different directions that the simple definition that I use when I'm talking about it is any type of art, work, or practice that incorporates walking. And it's that simple for me. Is that, and that way it leaves some space, some openness for interpretation, and people can bring their own experience to it. So if they're coming from a really conceptual approach, they are welcome to the idea of walking as artistic practice. And similarly, if you're coming from a very practical, functional type of approach, that those folks can find a place in this topic of study as well. So it sounds hyper simplistic, but it works for me, that definition. Yeah. And I think I find if I go too far down one direction or the other. I end up in realms of the question of what is art, and I'm less interested in what is art and more interested in what's something compelling. Like what's something that I'd like to spend some more time thinking about or doing. And that's usually where I land.
Yeah, I like that idea, and that makes a lot of sense because it's not a straightforward thing. It's a process, and we go with the flow when we're making art. Jerry Saltz, the art critic, sometimes posts like pictures of himself in the country, and he says, walking, not talking, or something like that as a caption. He's just like, just walking, not talking. He's got his big gulp that he likes to show off to everyone that he's so thrifty with his coffee and whatever. But his thing, it's kind of braggadocious, right? He's a critic, and says he's walking, not talking. And the whole idea is he's actually, by posting in social media, I guess, talking. So I'm not going to rag on Jerry Saltz. I like the guy, he's got a, he's got a persona that I think, it's good to critique. And but anyway, that whole idea though, that he, his big art critic is saying that walking, not talking, and just enjoying the surrounding environments. It's a message to us that that's such a rare instance too in our days, that we are bombarded with things like social media and this digital world too, that keeps us maybe outside of being physically in touch with our world. Like you mentioned too, in 2020, when the pandemic really forced us all to be virtual for quite a while, and some of us are still living in that virtual world, walking has been something of a salvation for many people. Because I remember when we first started cautiously getting out of the houses, and we're like, all right, we got to keep a distance from people, but we could still walk because they're saying, outside, fresh air, it's safer. So people were walking. I remember going on walks early on in the summer of 2020. And we're all like, all right, this seems safe, but it was also healing. And because not only are you getting out there, and after many people probably sedentary for so long, just having to stay at home and not be able to go to the gyms or go wherever they were going, because the parks were even closed for a while. So just that time when we were able to go back out, it felt healing. And that to me, I thought of it sort of in ways like there was a time when I would go out and I would walk through the woods or look at things in nature and apply artistic habits of mind or concepts to them, and think about the just maybe nature as nature, but also nature as a work of art, things like that. How can I interact with something in nature as an artist? And as artists, we like to create often, but creation also could just be interaction and socialization and expression, sort of more of like the Joseph Beuys kind of social sculpture idea, where we're not transforming an object all the time. We're transforming with our ideas and our social behaviors. I know there's definitely examples in the book and in your work too, where you're just being in an environment as an artist, and you're using walking as a form of social practice. And it's whether you have other people with you that you're guiding them through this experience. I think that's where the art comes in, is where you're sharing an experience and an expression in this poetic means with our bodies. But it's also very practical because, as I said, right, it's healing, and it's good for us to walk around. And if we're doing it with other people, that's even better, because we're sharing in that experience and socialization after a period of such isolation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and there's a section in the book too about the long history of walking as a way of aiding thinking or aiding healing, and it's lovely to reflect on how deep and how long that history is. That a lot of us during the pandemic, sort of stumbled upon it out of necessity, because we were all struggling and we needed that outlet outside. And it's kind of cool to add ourselves to a really established lineage of people who've been doing this and reaping the benefits, whether it's through our creative ideation and conceptualization, or through the purely physical, the wellness of it as well. So yeah, that's one of my favorite elements of walking as artistic practice.
Walking is so commonplace that it's to many of us we do it, and we might not know we're engaging in some of the concepts you mentioned in your book too, like observational and sensory experiences is certainly a big tenet of art and art making. But walking along the street, I see some people doing artistic things and they don't even know it. Like I remember my grandfather, he would walk all over the place with a cane, and he would just slightly alter some dirt around with it, create these markings with the cane, or just the way he was moving around too and interacting with people. And that in and of itself, he wasn't setting out to make art or be an artist, but he was engaging in this sort of observational and sensory experience, and walking with purpose. And I think that's the key when it becomes art is there's an intention and a purpose behind it. You mentioned like the idea of identity and positionality, like who walks where, what kind of rituals are involved with walking. Placemaking is probably something that I'd love to hear about too, how placemaking and activism go into this concept.
Oh yeah, I would say like place is a huge topic and a fraught and controversial topic. As I went into the research, there is, people have really strong feelings about place and how it's defined, and how that intersects with, as you said, identity and who gets to walk where. I think that's probably why the place chapter is one of the longest ones in the book too, is because there's just so much ground to cover relating to, one, how do we define a place? There's a lot of research and fields outside of art on how to define place. What is the difference between a space and a place? There are many ideas on that. And so I think that takes up a lot of real estate in the book. I'm just laying the groundwork so we can have constructive conversation about it. And how does that resonate with us as an art practice? And then there's the entire issue of walking in the Western world and colonized places. I spoke with several folks who study Native American heritage and Native American history, and there is a pretty strong emphasis on colonization in the book, and the idea that we need to service that, and we need to make sure that we are acknowledging in ways that we haven't historically acknowledged that colonization in North America and other areas across the globe, but especially since that's where I'm coming from in terms of authorship, is to make sure that I'm acknowledging that really important history. So we see that in the place chapter as well. And then just the multitude of ways that people have engaged with place as walking artists. And that, again, runs the gamut from the very, very, very conceptual to the very practical, the very sort of very accessible ways. I see this a lot in K through 12 education, and a lot in walking as a healthy practice, a wellness practice, familiarizing oneself with place. And so that can really help enhance health and well-being, especially as it relates to loneliness, which is an epidemic in the United States. And so, yeah, there's just a lot of ways in for the idea of place.
It's a lot to think about, and being mindful about it too. I like how you mentioned, though, in early education, it's something that is imparted upon our little ones, that while they're walking, they're being made to be familiar with the environment and using their motor skills and also object permanence to see things like landmarks. I remember being told, if I'm lost, go to this landmark here when we're in a crowded space. And just then that makes you really have to be in tune with where you are and the aesthetics of the environment, and also to recognize, how things are in flux all the time. Like you mentioned too, borders and land is such an abstract concept the colonial concept of borders really has confused so much, and it still is confusing. I look on just the different maps through time, and it's wild how these borders have been set up to, in many cases, just like cutting off landmarks and natural resources in ways that don't even make sense. I mean, they make sense to the capitalists, but like to the environmentalists and the indigenous peoples who use the land, it makes no sense the way that borders have been constructed. But the interesting thing about walking is you get a sense of how someone who knows this land and is in touch with this land prior to all of this industrialization and digital age distractions would have encountered their land and experienced their land and still do talk about the land. So for me, that's something that is really interesting and part of like the idea of when someone's walking, who is leading a walk and who is following along on a walk. For me, when I think about that, I think about guides, land guides, I think about park rangers, but I also very much think about the indigenous people who are the ones who encountered this pristine land. And there's elements of this pristine land that still exist, very rare pockets here in New York City, even. And thinking about it through that lens, I wish there were more examples of guided walking through these environments so that we would have a greater awareness of what's around us that has been there for ages and predates colonialism. And it's certainly important to acknowledge the land that we're walking on. In the book, you do these examples of like walk shops or walking exercises. So I'd love if you could describe like an example of one too. So maybe someone listening could get out of the house today on this lovely fall afternoon and do some getting in tune with this concept of walking artistically.
Absolutely. I think one of the most accessible and easily executed exercises in the book, and one that I often like to start off with, especially with somebody who's new to the idea of walking as artistic practice, is just a very simple sensory walk. And so what I would invite them to do is bring a notebook or a sketchbook or an audio recorder, however they like to record their thoughts on the walk. Some people like to take photos or video to record their thoughts. And as they go on a walk, and it doesn't have to be a long one, it could be a short walk, record what you're feeling sensorially. So we might be used to looking around, and that's a great starter because that's a really familiar engagement of the visual sense for those who have sight. And then go a little bit further. How does it feel physically to go on that walk? You might think about how does it feel through your feet? You might think about how does the wind feel? Is it warm or cool? So you're engaging that sense of touch. You can then think about what are you hearing? If you have the sense of hearing, you can think about what sounds are loud, what don't you hear on the on the walk as well. Excuse me. And then think about the trickiest one is taste, and that there aren't a lot of safe surfaces to taste as you're out there. But I've seen a lot of folks find tricky and fun ways to engage with taste on a walk, and that could be something as simple as if you're passing a water fountain, or if you're bringing some water with you or something to eat with you. You can think about how do things taste while you're walking? What do things taste like in that specific place that you are walking? And then I have to remember which one. Oh, and smell, of course.
Yes.
What do you smell? What smells are prominent? What might be missing? A lot of times, if you're in an urban space, you might smell cars or certain manufacturing areas if you're near a plant or something like that, or maybe you're near a bakery, etc. And then likewise, if you're walking in a more rural space, you might notice grasses. You might notice the smell of the sun on a tree or something like that. Warmed vegetation. Like there's all sorts of different smells depending on where you are. And then just gather all 5 of your sensory experiences, or however many senses you are able to engage with, and collect those materials. And after you finish the walk, take a moment to consciously review them. I think that's an important part of these exercises is the conscious engagement after the fact, so that you have fully engaged and you're present during the act of walking, but then you also take a moment to reflect. So there's an easy one for folks.
That's great. Yeah, anyone could do that right now. Just getting out of even while they're walking the dog or picking up the kids from school. Yeah, on a note about the taste too. My wife and I will be walking in our neighborhood, and she'll go over to a plant and pick off a flower or a leaf and eat it. And to me, it's a little bit. I'm like a city boy, and I'm still learning from her. And she's got an amazing knowledge of edible plants. So I wouldn't recommend this to anyone who doesn't know what they're picking and eating, but that's what she'll do. So on the note about it, you mentioned the taste and smell. She's very in tune to that, and yeah, I find going on walks with her to be a very aesthetic and both like intellectually and creatively stimulating. So it helps to have someone to go with too that can spur your inspiration as well. On that note, just a personal aside, but yeah, that's a great exercise to do, and the reflection is really also something that builds our insights about our environment and helps us to appreciate things on a deep level that we have the immediate sense of being there on the walk, and then later on thinking about it further and thinking about maybe the people and the different flora and fauna and how that all comes together. So thank you. That's been really great to hear from you on this research and this project, and highly recommend the book, especially for educators. The ebook is available. The hardcover one is also there, which would be great for schools, especially to have if they're thinking about social practice as a curriculum, and even just traditional art, because as you mentioned, there could be a lot of ways we incorporate it into more traditional art making, bringing back certain elements from our walk and turning them into a collage or an audio, as you say, an audio recording of things, soundscapes for an installation, photography, all this kind of traditional elements while we're walking we can incorporate in. But I think just starting out by being present and using our senses, like you said, is key, however we travel the world, by foot or otherwise.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I've been telling folks to have their library get a copy of it, because that hardcover works really well for libraries where many people are going to be handling the book, and can take it on wonderful trips. Like you said, traveling the world, we walk when we travel, and as you go from place to place, it can be a lot of fun to pull out an exercise and do a little something to heighten your senses, to heighten your awareness, to observe more keenly. And so, yeah, I just think it fits in so many great ways. And I'm excited to see what people do with it.
Likewise, me too. And I know I will definitely be incorporating some of the exercises too, both on a personal level and with readers of Artfully Learning and students, and because it's just such a practical way of incorporating art into our everyday lives. Seeing the whole concept of living artfully and living with purpose is when we incorporate these sensory and observational experiences into the world and make sense of it through that kind of lens. So I really appreciate you making a comprehensive guide for us to spur our inspiration and motivate us to expand upon ideas, because we're all going to have unique experiences on our walks, and that's the joy and the beauty of it, of this whole idea as walking like an artist.
I love that. You summed it up perfectly.
Thanks. Yeah. Well, thank you for giving us the framework, and there's a lot of different artists who do this. So it's definitely worth checking out the book, because there's so many different artists you mentioned, so many different projects. And I know you mentioned some on your website too, for more abridged. If people want to start there, they can look on your website and see some of the interviews with artists who incorporate walking into their practice, and your own work as well, which I mentioned in the blog post called How to Walk Like an Artist. So, so there's a lot of resources people can start out with and then delve deeper. And then, of course, just get out and do your own walking and artistic thinking and being. So thank you, Ellen, for your time today. And it's been a pleasure to speak with you.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks for having me.